Good evening, everyone. My name is Diana Larsen. I'm Assistant Director for Collections Management, Exhibition Design, and Curatorial Affairs here at the McMullen Museum. Welcome to the virtual McMullen Museum and to our Into the Collection series, focused on aspects of our permanent collection, which usually takes place live in the museum. This is our 5th virtual presentation, and we are very happy to have all of you join us today. The McMullen Museum's permanent collection is used for teaching in various disciplines at Boston College and is accessible to scholars for research by appointment. Tonight, we will examine some of the museum's new acquisitions of 19th century paintings and sculpture in brief presentations with questions at the end. I will start, followed by 3 of the museum's 2023 student ambassadors, undergraduates who work at the museum during the semester in various capacities. We are fortunate to have members of the Student Ambassadors Collections Committee here to speak with you about works of art they have each selected. You will hear from Lauren Landry, Victoria Oliviero, and Lauren Whitlock. I will begin today's presentation with a finished preparatory painting by British painter and designer Edward Coley Burne-Jones for one of the ceiling mosaics in the American Episcopalian Church, St. Paul's Within the Walls, in Rome. Dating from about 1888, the painting depicts the Annunciation and was donated to Boston College this year by Alexandra and Michael Altman in memory of Father Michael J. Himes. Edward Coley Burne-Jones, often referred to as the last pre-Raphaelite, was born in Birmingham, England in 1833. Having lost his mother as an infant, he had a lonely childhood and became an avid reader of Greek mythology, northern folk tales, and the poetry of Keats and Coleridge. He developed a romantic fascination with the Middle Ages and an interest in religion, spurred by the prevalent High Church movement in Oxford, which encouraged elaborate ritual and rich decoration in an explosion of new church buildings. After attending the Birmingham School of Art, Burne-Jones went to Oxford to study theology at Exeter College, where he met his lifelong friend and artistic associate, William Morris. The young men shared a passion for medieval art and literature and formed a brotherhood with other friends at Oxford, which idealized the aesthetics of the Middle Ages. They avidly read the poetry of Tennyson and the writings of influential art critic John Ruskin. His books, The Seven Lamps of Architecture and The Stones of Venice, touted the moral superiority of Gothic architecture and the important role of the medieval craftsman. A great patron of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Ruskin advocated an accurate observation of nature, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing. Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris traveled to northern France in 1855 to visit and study medieval cathedrals and churches, and it was at the conclusion of this trip that both men decided to dedicate their lives to art, William Morris to architecture and Edward Burne-Jones to painting. Also during this period at Oxford in 1856, Burne-Jones met Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the most prominent painter of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of British painters who encouraged a simple, direct depiction of nature, characteristic of Italian painting before the High Renaissance, and in particular before the time of Raphael, in reaction to what they thought of as an unimaginative historical painting prevalent in Victorian England. Burne-Jones developed an influential friendship and subsequently studied with Rossetti. Rossetti inspired him to have confidence in his own talent and encouraged him to paint what he liked best, quote, drawn from nature, but not drawn from nature, but from fancy, unquote. It was Rossetti who encouraged Burne-Jones to travel to Italy. In 1859, Burne-Jones took his first trip to Pisa, Milan, Florence, and Venice, where he studied the work of early Renaissance painters. He took several subsequent trips to Italy, in 1862 with Ruskin and his new wife Giorgiano, where they visited Venice, Verona, and Padua. In 1871, he traveled to Genoa, Pisa, Siena, and Rome, and in 1873, his final trip took him to Bologna and most significantly for tonight, as we will see, Ravenna. It is important to note that in 1861, William Morris started his firm, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, specializing in decorative work such as furniture, textiles, pottery, and stained glass, which became Burne-Jones's specialty. Morris built the Red House south of London in Bexley Heath, a gathering place for his circle of artists who furnished this palace of art with their designs. By the 1870s, Burne-Jones was also influenced by the emerging aesthetic movement of art for art's sake, championed by American painter James McNeill Whistler. A work of art had to be an object of beauty, and that was its sole raison d'etre, and artists were to be involved in architectural design as much as possible. Burne-Jones's artistic life was a continual pursuit for beauty. He wrote, quote, "Only this is true, that beauty is very beautiful, and softens and comforts and inspires and rouses and lifts up and never fails," unquote. Now to the McMullen Museum's painting. Affluent Americans began traveling to Italy from the late 18th century into the 19th century, often taking a grand tour of the country like their Anglican British predecessors. In 1861, Grace Church was founded to serve a growing American Episcopalian community in Rome. By 1870, Italy had unified, ending the temporal power of the popes over Rome, which allowed non-Catholics to build churches within the city walls. St. Paul's within the walls, the former Grace Church, was founded and land was purchased near the Quirinal Palace with the support of various wealthy patrons. Reverend Robert J. Nevin was the first rector of St. Paul's within the walls, himself a collector of late medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque art. In 1872, he commissioned the building and hired British architect George Edmund Street, with whom William Morris had studied, to design the church, the cornerstone of which was laid in 1873. Street's design was inspired by northern Italian architecture, specifically the Church of San Zeno in Verona, shown here. And the polychrome brickwork echoed the striped cathedrals of Siena and Orvieto. The interior seats 700, with its long nave culminating at the high altar. From the outset, Street envisioned mosaics decorating only the apse of his Romanesque-style church, while Reverend Nevin was already thinking of a more ambitious project. The mosaics, however, could only be executed as patrons stepped forward. In 1881, Sir Edmund Burne-Jones, who the architect knew through his former student William Morris, was hired to do mosaics for the apse and choir with money from banker Junius S. Morgan, father of J.P. Morgan. It was one of the largest commissions of his career and fulfilled a dream. As a young man, quote, his heart had been full of mosaics, unquote, after seeing them in Venice and Torcello on his first Italian trip with John Ruskin. Once engaged by Nevin for the American church mosaics, he wrote, quote, "The chance of doing public work seldom comes to me. If I could, I would work only in public buildings and in choirs where they sing," unquote. Burne-Jones's wife, Georgiana, wrote in her biography of her husband, quote, "He did not, of course, wish his work unseen, but the whole system of exhibitions was distasteful to him, and an easel picture but a makeshift. What he always sought for was to design on a large scale for special places. I want big things to do and vast spaces, and for common people to see them and say, oh, only oh, was one way he put it," unquote. Burne-Jones wrote further about his mosaic work in Rome, a quote again, "It's one of those things that I do outside painting, far away from it. It has more to do with architecture and isn't a picture a bit. Everything is done to make it not a picture, and the severe limitations of mosaic are all obeyed and observed. I love to work in that fettered way, and am better in a prison than in the open air always," The technical constraints of mosaic are echoed by the technical constraints of other applied arts, tapestry and stained glass in particular, both at which Burne-Jones excelled. Burne-Jones scholar Fiona McCarthy writes, quote, "Like William Morris, Burne-Jones was fascinated by the demands made by the craft in works of art, by materials and technique, and by evolving a channel of communication with the practitioners, the craftsmen actually working on the project, that would finally achieve the results he had envisioned," unquote. The scheme for the apse and choir of St. Paul's was inspired by the splendid Byzantine mosaics Burne-Jones had seen in Ravenna that covered the walls of several churches there with elaborate figural compositions complementing the interior architecture. Here are some photos from the Basilica of San Vitale and the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia from Ravenna to show this inspiration for the overall design. The nave of St. Paul's has a similar starry sky to the earlier mosaics. Burne-Jones's mosaics have greater perspective and a wider range of colors than the earlier mosaics, but they echo the overall treatment of the ceiling, the architectural niches, and arches. Burne-Jones did some 59 sketches and painting studies for the Roman mosaics. Now on to the decorative scheme. The architect Street died in 1881, and Burne-Jones almost gave up on the project until Reverend Nevin came to London and persuaded him otherwise, with a more elaborate scheme than the original of just the apse. Burne-Jones told a friend, quote, "Dr. Nevin has just gone, and the mosaic will be fun, won't it? Especially if it spreads over the church." The most difficult part of the project was translating his compositions into mosaic and making sure Signor Castellani and the Italian Venezia Murano Company executed his designs accurately using the correct color of glass pieces or tesserae. Burne-Jones made scaled cartoons of different sections of the composition, indicating the exact positioning of the individual tesserae. These cartoons are still under the mosaics of St. Paul's. Burne-Jones was reluctant to travel to Italy and to leave his studio. So he and William Morris spent every Sunday sorting out colors from a cabinet of tesserae and labeling them for the Italian workmen. The designs were settled in sketch form between about 1881 and 1886. Burne-Jones sent his assistant, Thomas Rooke, with instructions to oversee the execution of the mosaics after an initial error in translating his wishes. He wrote, quote, "Oh, rookie, scold them, pitch into them, bully them, curse, and refrain not," unquote. Nevin had to continue fundraising for the completion of the project, which caused several frustrating delays. Burne-Jones died before it was complete, and Rooke finished some final mosaics. The progression down the nave towards the apse is echoed by the themes as they are encountered by the visitor. In his biography of Edward Burne-Jones, Christopher Wood describes, quote, "a gentler, more Victorian version of Christianity, long on salvation, short on hell and damnation," unquote. On the first arch above the choir is the Annunciation, in an unusual desert landscape with mountains. The McMullen Museum's recent painting, here seen without its frame, is a study for this mosaic in St. Paul. This particular rendition of the theme is based on an early legend where Mary is drawing water from a spring when she encounters the Archangel Gabriel. The urn on her right side suggests this association. The Angelus, a Marian prayer said at dawn and early evening, is suggested by the reddening of the sky. On the left side is the pelican in her piety, a pelican piercing her breast to feed her young with her blood, a medieval symbol of Christ's sacrifice. Below the scene is the Latin inscription translated, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you, blessed are you among women." And on the other side, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done to me according to your word." The Secret Book of Designs at the British Museum, executed between 1885 and 1898, contains 220 drawings, which include some studies for the mosaics at St. Paul's within the walls. Here are two examples of sketches for the composition of the Annunciation. This mosaic was not completed until 1894. The cartoon and sketches sent in 1890. Our painting was 1888. The left side here, the left drawing, includes the inscription, as you can see, but the angel is earthbound. On the right side, though, the angel resembles more the final version. This pen and ink sketch was sent in a letter to Signor Castellani, October 1890, showing the lines along which the Annunciation cartoon was divided. I will be coming back to our painting. So, back to the church now. On the second arch above the choir, Burne-Jones represented the tree of forgiveness, also not complete until 1894. Christ appears with outstretched arms, crucified against a green tree of knowledge. But instead of being flanked by the Virgin and St. John, Burne-Jones has shown Adam and Eve and their children. Below is a Latin inscription from John's Gospel. On the rear wall of the apse, which was the first mosaic to be completed, is Christ in glory, with heaven and choirs of angels playing instruments at the top of the slide. The heavenly Jerusalem. Below is Christ seated in majesty in the center of the slide, enthroned between cherubim and seraphim. On the left, he holds a transparent orb and blesses with his right hand. His feet rest on the 4 streams of living water from Revelation and the rainbow. The archangels flank Christ, each standing before a gate of heaven. The empty one would have been for Lucifer. Below is a sea of firmament broken by inscriptions in Hebrew and Greek. A series of angels divides the upper from the lower half of the composition, separating heaven and earth. In the lower register are the saints and prophets, the church triumphant. Now to deal with the Annunciation theme for a little background. Over the course of his life, Burne-Jones painted many Annunciations, and I will show a few here. The first and earliest oil painting, dating from 1861, now in the Tate Gallery, is a triptych and shows the Annunciation flanking a depiction of the Adoration of the Magi. The style and palette of the painting indicates Burne-Jones's familiarity with early Renaissance art, as well as the work of the pre-Raphaelites. The angel and Virgin kneel facing each other in a garden with a curtain behind them. This watercolor, dating from the same period from the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, shows the angel and Mary standing in a garden, their positions reversed, and the angel swinging a censer rather than holding a lily. In 2 versions of this Flower of God Annunciation, dating from 1862 and 1869 respectively, Burne-Jones divides the space between the angel and Mary, outside versus inside. Elements from all these early paintings can be seen in this 1504 painting of the Annunciation by Venetian Renaissance painter Vittore Carpaccio, who Burne-Jones favored. For example, the division of the composition between the outside garden setting where the angel stands versus inside where Mary is, and the overall rich coloring. The artist treated the theme in stained glass as well, as shown in this lovely example designed in 1872 for Castle Howard and later adapted for Winchester Cathedral. In this richly foliated scene, the figures flank a tree of knowledge with the serpent curling up its trunk with a dove above. In the late 1870s, Burne-Jones used a large vertical format for many of his oil paintings. This Annunciation creates an entirely new feeling of the floating angel descending from above. The Virgin, likely modeled after his wife, has an urn beside her, suggesting she has been interrupted while drawing water, the theme he took up for the Roman mosaic and for our painting. The palette is subdued and ethereal here. a drawing from the National Gallery of Canada, could be a study for the floating angel, although the positioning of the arms has changed, and he holds a lily. In 1880, Edward Burne-Jones and his wife bought a holiday house on the coast in Rottingdean, East Sussex, where he loved to work. Here, the artist executed an exquisite little album called The Flower Book, containing 38 watercolor paintings in roundels, which he bequeathed to the British Museum. It was published by his wife in 1905 in 300 editions. This painting of the Annunciation in a cornfield from that volume characterizes Burne-Jones's love for the landscape around him at Rottingdean. There was a cornfield behind the house. The elongated depiction of this annunciating angel is quite a departure from his earlier versions, which are more lifelike. Here, a stylized figure hovers above the ground with heart-shaped wings and seems to herald the advent of symbolism in art, where spirituality and mysticism prevail. Burne-Jones was popular with the French symbolists who discovered his work at the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris. The McMullen Museum's painting study for the Roman mosaics continues with this kind of stylization, using gold to highlight the angel's hair. The landscape of the golden cornfield is almost emulated by the golden sky behind the mountainous desert inside the arch in our painting. But here, the figures are separated from each other to accommodate the neo-Gothic architecture of the church. The Virgin is equally elongated, with the urn on the ground behind her. Burne-Jones includes inscriptions in the lower corners of the painting, much in the manner of Rossetti, indicating the strong relationship between words and art. These exact words appear in the arch below the Annunciation scene in the mosaic rendition, which I read earlier. The inclusion of a pelican in our Annunciation scene and the Roman mosaic is very unusual. Burne-Jones had been recently preoccupied with this theme, using it in his design for a stained glass window produced by William Morris's firm for St. Martin's Church in Brampton, Cumbria. And this sketch of a pelican from 1885 appears in the volume of designs from the British Museum. The McMullen Museum's painting has an exquisite original frame, likely designed by Burne-Jones himself, echoing the practice of the pre-Raphaelites, who often designed the frames for their paintings. Inspired by early Renaissance carved frames, such as the one shown here on the right, it shares the use of rosettes at the four corners and a flat area inside of a decorative relief border. To conclude, Burne-Jones's work is well represented in Boston. The Fogg Museum at Harvard has over 100 of the artist's work, mostly on paper. He was commissioned to create stained glass windows for Trinity Church in 1880 and 1882, respectively. Shown here on the left of this slide is the visit of the Magi in the north transept, and on the right, David instructing Solomon for the building of the temple, known as the Dexter window in the baptistry. Both windows were executed by William Morris and Company. If you haven't seen them, I encourage you to do so. And our painting will soon be on view in our newly renovated space. I conclude my presentation with a portrait of Edward Burne-Jones at work in the final year of his life, painted by his son, Philip. It was a prolific life indeed. Thank you.
Lauren will have you share your screen.
Yep. Oh, that's not it. Do you see it?
Yes.
Does everyone see? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Landry. I am a senior at Boston College, and I'm also on the Students Collection Management Committee. Today, I'm going to be talking about this beautiful painting right here by William Morris Hunt. It's called Women Knitting and Cow. And in parentheses, it has the title Fontainebleau, which I will explain later. So this amazing painting, I'm going to use it as a synthesis to be able to talk about really the legacy of William Morris Hunt, as he was a very influential teacher to American painters in the 19th century. And today I'll basically be arguing that he played an intrinsic role in translating the French realist style into American art, and how because of his teaching practice in New England. And we're very lucky that this area is so rich in histories. Um, oh, there we go. All right. So William Morris Hunt, not to be confused with William Morris, who Diana talked about, not the architect, but the painter. So he was born in 1824 in Brattleboro, Vermont, and he died in Appledore, New Hampshire in 1879. So he had a relatively short life, but he was a strong New England man. His father was a congressman in Vermont, and he was a well-educated man since his family was well off. He went to Harvard, but he actually dropped out his third year and went with his mother to France to study in France, and that's when his love for art began. He began as an apprentice drawing for an American artist named Henry Kirk Brown. And then from there, he only did that for a year or so and went to the Dusseldorf Academy in Germany, which is one of the most esteemed art academies in Europe, which was founded in 1762. After going to Dusseldorf, he then studied under another artist named Thomas Couture from 1846 to 1852. While he was with Couture, he traveled all around France and a little bit around Europe as well, and into England a little bit. But he really fell in love with the French culture, with French art, and he met many of the contemporaries of that time, many of the famous names that we would know from the middle 19th century. And that's where he met Jean-François Millet, who is, as we would know him today, as one of the leaders of the French realist movement. So in 1851, when William Morris Hunt first saw this painting, he was so moved that he felt that he needed to follow Millet to Paris. He immediately needed to change directions with his art, and he needed to study instead of with Couture, with Millet, because he found this so beautiful. So let's take a pause to visually analyze and see what the influence was on his style. I think in terms of brushstroke, we can immediately see the evolution of being able to see the facture, seeing the paint in motion. But the real tenets of realism is focusing on the earthly colors and the subject matter, the people, the focus on an individual person of everyday life within the 19th century. While there was so much industrialization, there was a lot of urbanization as well, but to focus on the people who were still in the countryside, who were still living in a different antiquarian lifestyle compared to the booming bustle of trains and factories. And so the realism movement wanted to focus on these people and to highlight them and to show them in a beauty and a synonymous way to nature. So then now to return after his traveling and learnings in France, he came to Boston or he came to New England first. Sorry, he did a stop off in Rhode Island, and that's where he met John Lafarge. So John Lafarge, we might know as he painted the ceiling in the MFA, but we also know him here at the McMullen for the beautiful stained window that we have in our foyer. And so John Lafarge, he's most famous for either painting and for stained glass windows, but we should remember that he was William Morris Hunt was the teacher of John Lafarge. And I wanted to show this portrait, which is at the Met in New York, because it does demonstrate the influence of the painting style with the earthly colors, with the very gentle but still very visible brushstrokes in the portrait, and the haziness. I think there is a point to not emphasize, even though it's called realism, not the realistic aspects of it, but the overall, it's still not to make a pun, but impression of what you're looking at, and to capture a mood and aesthetic. All right. And so now to talk a little bit more about French realism and rooting us in the roots of that so we can better understand the painting itself. So realism is considered the unembellished depiction of nature or contemporary life. And that is the official definition of the artistic movement. But it's a long tradition of showing the everyday life. And we've seen this from many painters in history, from Caravaggio, from the Dutch and Flemish painters of the Northern Renaissance, and even in Hellenistic statues. But it's an aesthetic, I'm so sorry, guys. It's an aesthetic that has really evolved, and it really came to light in the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. And there became such a large discrepancy between the lower classes and the rising middle class. Within this realism movement, the main founders were this group called the Barbizon School. And the Barbizon School, they were self-named in that because they were a group of French painters that loved to paint outside what they wanted to do. And the main place that they went to was the Forêt de Fontainebleau, or the Forest of Fontainebleau. And that is, you'll see it ties back to the title of our original painting. So the Forest de Fontainebleau was a place, it was attached to the Chateau Fontainebleau, but it's the forest, all the land that was surrounding it. And many of the middle class members and even lower class members would travel to it. It actually became a tourist destination in the 19th century. And many people like to go there. And it was known for its beautiful pine trees and oak trees. It was well maintained since it was part of the hunting chateau of the King of France. And so as people began to go there more, artists would go there with their art kits, and they have their small little pig bladders of paint and pigments, and they would paint outside. They would like to look at the nature. And so there's multitudes of paintings or sketches as well from the Forêt de Fontainebleau. And so we can wonder if William Morris Hunt was here at Fontainebleau when he made the original sketch, perhaps, but even though the painting was made later than, and so he was probably back in the US, or if he was just inspired by the mission of what the Barbizon School was doing when they were at Fontainebleau by trying to paint normal people, trying to paint the life of the French countryside. And so now looking at our beautiful painting, returning to it, so what can we learn from the realisms and the Barbizon School? Well, we're looking at glorifying, or not necessarily glorifying, but really showing a flattering light on the working class. We're showing them returning to nature, returning to doing the true God's work. And it's a portrait style. We have an intimate look at this woman, and she's humbly looking down while working, but she's still seen in an angelic glow. And the warm haze and the warm colors of the painting does make it an even more intimate scene as we look closely. And she's framed by trees and greenery and shrub, but he artfully uses browns and orange to create that the luscious background, but it also has a humble tone to it because it's not necessarily vibrant and blooming. It's also very similar to the sower that I previously showed. It has a raised foreground. So by pushing back the background and really bringing the foreground close to us, it really does zoom in on this one young woman. And also, it's very similar to in the 19th century, there's this new trend of cropping the image. Cropping maybe not like in like when we use photos and we make them smaller, but in the sense we're no longer getting the whole view of the scene. We're really focusing on the person, and we're focusing on the subject. And this really does continue to add to the idea of focusing on the person and focusing on the people. All right, thank you guys so much.
Hi, everyone. My name's Lauren Whitlock, the other Lauren, and I also work in collections management with Diana and Lauren and Victoria. And today I'll be discussing Eastman Johnson's Lady Playing the Harp from 1860 to 1869. And I really want to discuss Johnson and his ability to synthesize different European genres to create a truly American style. So born in 1824 in Lovell, Maine, Eastman Johnson was best known for his work in genre and portrait painting. He had European training, which is important, and trained in Dusseldorf, Germany. He also spent time in The Hague to study the Dutch old masters, which I'll make some comparisons to later on. And he also concentrated on painting with Emanuel Lutz. And now I'm going to do a little visual analysis. So the gold, I think, is really important here. The woman's face is almost completely covered in shadow, while her golden dress and the golden harp shine through. The darkness itself creates a depth in the room that is all-consuming. The harp is in the forefront, and it creates a harsh Baroque angle, much like the Dutch masters. And the bottom of the painting, which it might be a little hard to see, has this beautiful, colorful rug that I think brings the audience back into the room with the woman. And next slide, Lauren, please. The motif of the harp was something that Johnson played with a little. This is called the voice of the harp. And this one is, though it depicts the harp, I think it's very different from The Lady with the Harp, because it's more about the portraiture and it's more about what this young girl looks like. This young girl is thought to be an Italian immigrant. And something that was really important to Johnson was to depict different marginalized groups in a way that humanized them. I also think that the usage of the harp and the voice shows how music was a voice for this young girl who maybe didn't have it in any other way. So next, sorry. So next, this one seems like it's coming out of nowhere, but Emanuel Lutz was a painter that Johnson studied under, and I think this is a most well-known painting, but I think this idea of a historical painting that is highly moralistic and maybe even propagandistic, and not really very realistic, is a part of Johnson's style. So my kind of overall thesis is that he brings the highness of this style with the quote unquote lowness of a genre style and a scene of everyday life. Next. So this is where I bring a comparison to the Dutch old masters. When Johnson studied in The Hague, he was known as the American Rembrandt. And I think that's really important here, even though this isn't a Rembrandt. But this is Jan Stein, young woman playing a harpsichord to a young man. And I just, as soon as I saw this, I saw the direct comparison with Lady Playing Harp. In this one, the man in the background is a little harder to see, and he's kind of sucked into the shadow. But the gold that's Jan Stein uses that creates a comparison to the rich darkness of the room and the importance of the shadow in the room is real, like looks a lot like Johnson's. So next slide. And then I really like the idea of Johnson being the young American Rembrandt. So Rembrandt was known for his genre scenes. I think Johnson was also known for his genre scenes, but also bringing that highness of the historical portraiture that he learned from Lutz into his work. But this painting in particular, Rembrandt's self-portrait from his Leiden period and Eastman Johnson, Lady Playing the Harp, really connected for me in terms of how an artist can show interiority without showing a face, and how maybe the darkness upon the face is a way to show what's going on without having to show what's going on. So I think it was an important artistic choice, and that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm Victoria. I'm also a senior in the collections management department in the McMullen Museum. And today I'm looking at this bust by Hiram Powers. which was sculpted between 1865 and 1867. And to put that into perspective, that's towards the end and right after the American Civil War. However, this piece was probably made in Florence, where Powers lived towards the second half of his life. It's a bust of an Oceanid, or a sea nymph from Greek mythology, who was named Clytie. If we can go to the next slide. So Hiram Powers was born in Vermont in 1805 and then moved to the Midwestern US, where he tried a series of working trades, kind of jumping around from place to place and from trade to trade, trying to figure out what he wanted to do. Eventually, he settled on sculpture. And once he did, he moved to Florence, Italy in 1837 to pursue this vocation. And like the other 19th century artists we've been looking at, he mainly does this because he wanted the classical European training. And also in Northern Italy, there was an abundance of marble, which he preferred to sculpt with. His most famous work is the Greek Slave, which is showed here, and it was toured in the US and is currently housed in the Smithsonian Art Museum. The Greek Slave was so popular because it was the first fully female nude to be publicly exhibited in America. And if you look at the next slide, I have an illustration of this on display in New York City. Both Clytie and the Greek Slave are neoclassical sculptures, meaning that they imitate classical artwork and implement Greco-Roman themes. And in this case, Clytie is a nymph. We can go to the next slide. And in 19th century America, neoclassicism was very, very popular because it emphasized the young country's democratic identity, which was a notion very much taken from classical Athens, the first democracy. And just to show how popular neoclassicism was in the early American history, if you look at the United States Capitol building, that's completely modeled after Greco-Roman architecture between the columns and the dome and the facade. And so, however, female nudes, on the other hand, from neoclassicism was not very popular and was seen as controversial. So Clytie here and the Greek Slave is both popular and controversial, kind of in the same view. Next slide. So in Greek mythology, Clytie was a sea nymph who fell in love with the sun god Helios, but he was already in love with a Persian princess. So out of jealousy and spite, Clytie told the princess's father of her affair, and he killed the princess for breaking her vows of chastity. Helios, the sun god, of course, would never return Clytie's love, so she resigned herself to sit naked upon the ground and stare at the sun forever. In some versions of the myth, she turns into a heliotrope, but in the most popular version, she turns into a sunflower. So it's a myth that explains why sunflowers turn to the sun. And this is the earliest example I could find of this myth. I couldn't find any ancient examples of it. This one is from the 17th century, and it's in Versailles. If we go to the next slide. So Powers very much references the little details of this myth in this one bust. For instance, the flower in her hair, her diadem crown, it's a sunflower. And here's a comparison here between the leaves and also the seeds. And her nudity is emphasized in this bust by her exposed breasts. And she also has a forlorn look as she stares at the sun, at her unrequited love, Helios. And so I personally think that Hiram Powers chooses the time right before her transformation to depict her, when she's not fully nude, but while she's also still retaining some human qualities, while also exploiting some of the floral aspects. And so for the last slide, I think it's just nice that in the McMullen Museum, we make her face the sun in the window, kind of referencing the myth, but also it really, yeah, I think it's a wonderful piece that does a lot in one sculpture. It's not really like a painting where you can have multiple objects and figures telling the myth, but right here, Powers just does it in one figure, actually half of a figure, so.
Well, thank you, all of you.